The first thing I noticed when the bus turned onto Maple Creek Road was that our porch light was on. I know that sounds like nothing, a porch light, but I had been away for 16 months, 12 of them, in a place where I was genuinely not certain I was going to survive. And for the last 4 of those months, lying in a military hospital bed in Germany, staring at a ceiling that was too white and too clean, every version of this moment I had imagined had included the same detail. A small white cross in the cemetery behind First Baptist, my name cut into it, and a wife who had finally let herself be talked into saying goodbye. I had built that image so many times in the dark that I half believed it. I had prepared for it the way you prepare for the thing you're most afraid of, not because you want it to be true, but because you can't afford to be destroyed by it when you're still trying to get home. So when the bus made that turn onto Maple Creek, and I saw the orange glow of that porch light burning through the November evening, I pressed my hand flat against the window glass and I made myself breathe, slowly, until my chest unclenched. There was no wreath on the door, no ribbon, no leftover flowers from a service that had already been held. She had not buried me. I want you to hold that for a moment, because I have spent every day since then trying to understand what it actually costs a person to do what Clara did. What it takes to stand in the middle of a town that has collectively made up its mind, in a house full of people bringing casseroles and condolences and pamphlets from grief counselors, and look every single one of them in the eye and say, "He is not dead, and I will not pretend that he is." From the outside, that kind of conviction looks like denial. It looks like a woman who hasn't found her way to accepting reality. Doctors call it a natural stage. Well-meaning people nod at each other over her head and talk about giving her time. But from where I was sitting on that bus, watching that light through the cold glass, it looked like the only true thing I had seen in 16 months. But let me take you back to a road outside a village in eastern Afghanistan, on a Tuesday morning in July, when everything that came after started. My name is Nathan Reed. I was 26 when I deployed with the 3rd Infantry, and I had been married to Clara May Whitfield. Clara Reed, she corrected people. Every time, gently, but without apology. For almost 2 years. We had gotten married fast, the way some military couples do, though for us it wasn't pressure and it wasn't fear. It was the simple arithmetic of 2 people who had known each other since they were 14 years old, sitting 3 desks apart in a freshman English class, who had grown up together and apart and back together again, and who, when deployment orders came down, could not find a single good reason to wait anymore. We got married in her parents' backyard in Harlow, Tennessee, on a Saturday in April, with 83 people and 1 borrowed tent, and a 3-layer cake her sister Sophie had made from scratch that leaned slightly to the left but tasted like something from a dream. I wore my dress uniform. Clara wore her grandmother's pearl earrings and a white dress she had found at a consignment shop in Chattanooga that fit her exactly right, which she took as a sign from someone. She cried when I kissed her. Not the sad kind. The other kind. The kind that comes from something being exactly right. From recognizing a moment that is going to matter for the rest of your life. 3 months later, I was on a plane to Bagram. Clara and I wrote letters. Real ones. On paper, in envelopes, mailed through the postal system like it was 1943. She had read once that soldiers during Vietnam said handwritten letters felt more like the person was actually in the room, and she had decided that was how we were going to do it. And once Clara decided something, that was simply how it was going to be. Every week, sometimes twice, I wrote her about the heat and the quality of the dust, which got into everything, and about the long stretches of boredom between the things that weren't boring, and about the strange and unwanted philosophy you develop when you have too many hours and not quite enough to fill them. She wrote me about the diner, about Sophie's new boyfriend on whom she was deliberately withholding judgment, about the vegetable garden she'd started behind the house where the tomatoes were, in her exact words, staging a deliberate protest. She always ended the same way. 3 words. Then her name. I'm waiting. Clara. I read those words every single time, no matter how many times I'd already read them, and felt something settle in my chest, like ballast, like the weight that keeps a boat oriented when the water gets unpredictable. 11 months in July, my platoon was moving through a stretch of road we had run many times. I was in the third vehicle of a 5-vehicle convoy. I remember the light that morning, flat and white and absolute. The kind of desert light that bleaches color out of everything it touches. I remember Darnell talking at serious length about his mother's sweet potato pie, the precise and specific way she made it, with the kind of detail you can only produce when you've been away from home long enough to need that particular conversation. I was half listening and watching the road. Then the world came apart. The first device hit the lead vehicle. The convoy stopped. The second device was closer, and I remember the sound. A sound like a door being slammed by something enormous. And then there is a long blank space where my memory used to be. What I know now from debriefings and records and fragments assembled slowly over years. 4 soldiers died in the attack. 3 were wounded. In the aftermath, my dog tags were recovered from a body in the wreckage of the first vehicle. A body burned past any other identification. The Army ran the tags, matched the name, made the only determination they had grounds to make. Private First Class Nathan Reed, killed in action. A notification team was dispatched to Harlow, Tennessee. I was not dead. I was captured, unconscious, and being moved toward a location that a joint special operations team would spend 14 months finding. But none of that had happened yet. First, 2 men in uniform had to walk up the front path of our house and knock on a door. Clara told me much later, months after I came home, on a night when we had finally reached the place where we could talk about it directly, that she had felt something shift before they knocked. She was at the kitchen sink washing a coffee mug, she said, and the air in the house changed, the way air changes just before weather arrives. Not the thing itself, but the signal. She looked at the clock, 9:14 in the morning. She went to the front door before the knock came. Captain Mercer delivered the notification the way he had been trained. The Army regrets to inform you. Killed in action. IED attack. Dog tags recovered. I am very sorry. Clara looked at him without speaking for a long moment. Then she said, quietly, Nathan isn't dead. Mercer looked at her with the careful, patient attention of someone watching a person stand too close to an edge. Mrs. Reed, he said, I understand how devastating this is to hear. I'm sure it is, she said. But there's been a mistake. He isn't dead. She thanked both men for coming, closed the door, and called his parents. His father Thomas arrived that same afternoon, a man not naturally given to visible feeling, and the grief on his face when she opened the door was the most unguarded thing Clara had ever seen on him. He said he was sorry. She said there had been a mistake. He looked at her the way the captain had. Clara, he said, the Army doesn't make this kind of error. I know Nathan, she said, and he's not dead. She showed me the notebook later, the one she kept in the drawer by the bed, where she put things she couldn't say out loud. The entry from that day. Thomas came. He cried. I made him coffee. They think I am broken, but I am the only person in this room who is thinking clearly right now. Nathan is alive. I know the shape of his absence, and this isn't it. I know the shape of his absence. I read that sentence and had to set the notebook down and go stand outside. The pressure on her was immediate and came from every direction. His parents began discussing a memorial. The Army assigned a casualty assistance officer, Sergeant Holt, a careful and thorough and genuinely kind man who arrived with forms and resources and the professional conviction that what Clara needed was support in accepting a reality he had no grounds to doubt. Sophie, who loved her sister more than she loved most things, sat across the kitchen table in August and said, as gently as she could, Claire, you need to let yourself grieve. Clara looked at her sister. I'm not going to grieve someone who's still alive. She filed a formal request for additional verification of remains. She wrote to her congressman's office. She wrote to the Army's Casualty Affairs Division and to a veterans advocacy organization she had found after hours of searching. She went back to Sergeant Holt with a specific, organized account of why she believed the identification was in error. He listened seriously and told her, with what she described as real regret, that the standard identification process had been followed, and the Army's determination would stand. She thanked him and wrote another letter. A grief counselor the casualty office recommended came to the house one afternoon in September. A soft-spoken woman named Dr. Alicia Park, who had helped hundreds of military families navigate exactly this kind of loss. She sat across from Clara at the kitchen table for 2 hours. She was patient and informed, and she spoke about grief in terms that were clearly not theoretical. And Clara heard every word and said, quietly, at the end, "I understand what you're telling me. I'm telling you that my husband is alive." Dr. Park left her card. Clara put it in a drawer and kept the porch light on. His parents held the memorial service on September 1st. Clara did not go. She had told Diane and Thomas in advance and explained why, and said she was sorry. What happened on Diane Reed's face when Clara told her, Clara chose not to describe to me, because she said she had no desire to put that image in my mind. After that, Diane stopped calling. When they crossed paths at the grocery store in late October, in the canned goods aisle, it lasted under a minute and left Clara standing between shelves of soup, feeling more alone than she had felt since the notification. That night's notebook entry, Diane at Kroger. She looked past me. I understand exactly why. I would probably do the same if I believed what she believes. But I don't believe it, and I'm not going to start. The diner was its own continuous ordeal. Customers who meant well and said the wrong things. Women from First Baptist who touched her arm and said they were lifting her up. Dot, the owner, who genuinely loved Clara and left flowers on the counter with a sympathy card in neat handwriting. Clara thanked Dot, put the flowers on the windowsill, worked her shifts, and came home every evening and turned on the porch light. Every night, for 14 months. She couldn't explain it as a rational decision when I asked. She said it was just what she did, the way she had always turned it on when I worked late. Because leaving a light on for someone is the most basic possible way of saying the world still has a place set for you. She kept the light on in other ways too. She made the bed on both sides every morning. She kept the chair at the kitchen table that was mine, pushed in at its angle. Not pushed in flush against the table, the way you'd push in a chair no one uses, but at the slight outward angle of a chair someone sits in and gets up from. She cooked for 2 on Sundays, even when Sophie had stopped coming by regularly because the visits were getting difficult. Even when the extra portion sat in a container in the refrigerator until it had to be thrown out on Tuesday. She told me these things, not all at once, but in pieces, over months. In the way you tell someone a story when the telling of it is still something you have to feel your way through. I think she told me slowly because some of it was hard to say without sounding like she had been half mad with grief, and she needed me to understand that she hadn't been. She had been completely, utterly clear-eyed. She had just refused to let the furniture of our life rearrange itself around an absence that wasn't real. Now let me tell you what was happening to me during all of this. Because the two things were running side by side, and I've spent a long time trying to understand whether they were connected in a way that goes beyond what can be easily explained. I came back to full consciousness about 4 days after the attack. Stone room, plywood over the single window. My ribs were wrapped and the wound on my left arm had been dressed badly and was starting to show it. 2 guards outside. Neither spoke English. I spent the first 2 full days in that room doing an inventory of what I knew. I was captured. The convoy had been hit. I didn't know how many had survived. I didn't know if the army was looking for me specifically, or if they even knew I was alive. What I did know, and I mean this literally, not as a way of speaking, was that I was going to stay alive. Not because I had a plan, not because I was braver than I actually was, because I had a wife in Harlow, Tennessee, with pearl earrings and a lopsided wedding cake, and 3 words at the bottom of every letter, and I had told her I was coming home, and I did not intend to be wrong about that. On the worst days, the days the infection made clear thinking effortful, the days when the isolation worked at the edges of things and made the fixed points of memory feel uncertain, I recited what I knew to be true. My name, the date we were married, the color of the kitchen walls in our house, the specific way she smelled when I came home to her, something like cut grass, and whatever soap she used. Her handwriting, The 3 words at the bottom of every letter. I'm waiting. Clara. I said that to myself on the worst nights like a compass bearing. She is waiting. She doesn't know where you are, but she is waiting. Get up. And something in me held. I cannot explain it more precisely than that. Something held the way good rope holds. There was one night in November, 4 months in, when the infection peaked, and the fever was high enough that the fixed points started to drift. I lost track of how many days I had been there. I lost track, for a while, of whether the thing I was remembering was a real memory or something I had constructed. I lay on the floor of that room for what might have been hours, and I said her name, out loud, into the dark, because it was the most certain thing I had access to. Clara. Not a prayer exactly, more like a fact I needed to state aloud to keep it from becoming abstract. Clara. I'm going to get home. The fever broke by morning, and the fixed points came back into focus, and I got up. She also kept a second notebook, she told me, the one she had started after the first one filled up around month 7. She showed me both eventually. The second one was different in tone from the first. The first was sharp and certain, full of the specific anger of someone who knows she's right and can't make anyone else believe it. The second was quieter. There were entries that were only 2 or 3 lines. There were dates she had simply written, still waiting, and then her name, Clara, the way she signed her letters to me, as if she was writing to me there too, as if the notebook was a letter she didn't know how to mail. I read both notebooks over the course of about a week, a few pages at a time, because more than that was too much to hold. When I finished the second one, I went and found her in the garden, and I stood there for a minute before she looked up, and I said, I read it. She set down the trowel, and she looked at me. All of it? All of it. She nodded slowly. Then she said, I think I needed somewhere to put it so it didn't take up the whole house. I understand, I said. I think you were talking to me. She considered that for a moment. Then she said, I think I was. In December, 11 months in, I was moved. It felt like worsening. Change without control always does. But the new location, as I learned later, had placed me within range of a joint special operations team that had been building intelligence in the area for months. A shift in my captor's pattern had made things careless in ways that mattered. I knew none of this. I knew different walls. There was a stretch of about 3 weeks in January, the 12th month, that was the worst I'd been through. The infection had come back in a new place, and my captors had less medication than before, and the room I was in was colder than it had been in December. And the combination of those things brought me to a place where the certainty I had been carrying started to feel less like a fact and more like a thing I was desperately performing, an act of will with nothing behind it. I lay on the floor of that room on the worst night, and I thought, what if I'm wrong? What if she has held the service? What if the house on Maple Creek Road has a white cross in front of it, and Clara has put my shirts in boxes, and the chair at the kitchen table is pushed in flush? What if she's had to do all of that, and I'm lying here like an idiot, believing in something that stopped being true months ago? I lay there with that thought for a long time, and then I thought about her handwriting. I thought about the specific look of those 3 words at the bottom of every letter. I'm waiting. The way the letters were formed, the slight leftward lean of her cursive, the period after Clara that was always a little heavier than the others, like she was pressing down. I thought, she is not someone who signs her name to something she doesn't mean. I thought, she is not someone who says she is waiting when she has stopped. And I got back up off the floor. In February, 14 months after the Convoy Attack, the rescue came. My memory of it is fragmented. I remember noise. I remember hands that moved with a confidence I recognized immediately as friendly. The inside of a helicopter. A medic's face close to mine. Reed, we got you. You're going home. I was flown to Landstuhl in Germany, and I was there for 6 weeks. In the first week, a nurse named Patrice helped me write a message for the Army's Casualty Notification Office. She read it back to me when it was done. I'm alive. I'm in Germany. Tell Clara to leave the light on. She looked up from the page. Is that what you want to say? Yes, I told her. That's exactly what I want to say. I don't know how long it took for that message to reach Harlow. I was unconscious for most of that week. Sophie was with Clara at the diner on the Thursday afternoon when the call came. Clara stepped outside the way she always did for calls during her shift. She stood on the sidewalk on Main Street in Harlow in February and listened to the army tell her that her husband had been found, had been rescued, was recovering in Germany, and would be home within 6 weeks. Sophie told me that Clara stood without moving for about 30 seconds. Then she said, quietly, to the February air, "I knew." And she sat down on the curb on Main Street and cried for the first time in 14 months. People always ask what made her so certain when everyone around her had accepted a different reality. And I have thought about this longer and harder than I have thought about almost anything else. And I believe the honest answer is that certainty might be the wrong word for what she had. Certainty implies evidence, something you can point to. What she had was refusal. There is a real difference between knowing something is true and refusing to accept that it's over. And it matters to understand that difference. She didn't have proof. She had the texture of 16 years of knowing me, the specific weight of what our marriage felt like, the feel of what his absence normally felt like. And that familiar weight didn't match what she was being told. So she refused to release it. Quietly, consistently, not because she was certain, because she was unwilling to act as though she wasn't. The 6 weeks in Germany were strange in a way that's hard to articulate. I was recovering physically, which gave the days a structure. There were doctors and physical therapists and meals at regular times and lights that went on and off on a schedule. But mentally, I was in 2 places at once. I was in a hospital bed in Landstuhl, and I was also, constantly, on Maple Creek Road, walking toward our house, imagining what I was going to find. I had the message that had been sent, telling Clara I was alive. I didn't know what had happened in Harlow over the 14 months. I didn't know if she had held the service. I didn't know if she was still in the house. I didn't know what the town had done to her, or what his parents had said, or whether the accumulated weight of all of it had eventually worn down what I had always believed was the most unshakable thing about her. A social worker came and asked how I was doing with uncertainty, and I told her I was managing. What I meant was, I am counting the days until I can get on a plane and find out. I came home in early November. The army offered a formal homecoming. I said no. I took the bus from Nashville and got off at the corner of Maple Creek and First Street with my bag and my slightly too large boots, and I stood on the corner in the early dark, and I looked down the road. Porch light on. No wreath, no ribbon. I walked down Maple Creek slowly, 30 pounds lighter than I'd been the last time I walked it. My left arm still weak, taking my time. Past the Henderson place where the old dog had died, and the porch was quiet. Past our mailbox, still leaning at the same old angle, to the front step with the new crack in it, and I knocked on my own front door, her footsteps inside, quick, the specific rhythm of her walking fast, which I had not heard in 16 months, and which I apparently had memorized without knowing it until I heard it again. The footsteps stopped on the other side of the door, then the door opened. Blue sweater I didn't recognize, hair shorter than when I'd left. She looked at me for 1 full second to make sure I was real. Then, "You're late," I said. "I know." And her arms came around me and mine around her, and we stood in that doorway without another word for a long time, and the porch light burned above us. What I found in the house, slowly, as I came back to myself, the mantel bare. No photograph, no flag, no candle. An empty shelf, waiting. In the drawer beneath it, my letters bundled with a rubber band, and underneath them, a sealed envelope with my name in her handwriting. She left the room while I opened it. 1 page. It said, "They came today. 2 men in uniform." I'm not going to write down what they told me, because writing it gives it more reality than it deserves, and it doesn't deserve any. I know what people are going to say now, and I know how this is going to go. But I know you, Nathan. I know the specific way you come back into a room you've left, like you're checking to see if everything is still where it was. I know you still can't sleep on your left side, no matter what we try. I know that you have been helping me make sense of things since we were 14 years old, and I do not believe someone like that just stops. I didn't feel it stop. So I'm writing you this to tell you I'm not doing this. I'm not holding a service, and I'm not saying that word they used, and I'm leaving the light on every night until you come down this road. Don't make me wait forever. She hadn't signed her name. Just, I'm waiting. I folded it back into the envelope and went to find her. She was at the kitchen sink. I put my hand on her shoulder, and she reached up without turning and covered my hand with both of hers. We stood there. There was nothing that needed to be said right then. The saying could wait. Coming home was not a single moment, and it was not simple, and I want to say that plainly, because stories like this can make it sound as though the surviving was the hard part, and everything after it was just the reward. It wasn't. Physical recovery took most of a year. The other kind took longer and is in some ways still ongoing. There were nights I came up out of sleep in our room not knowing where I was, and Clara learned on those nights to wake up quietly. Not urgently, just to put her hand somewhere I could feel the weight of it. She learned that without being told. There was the slow repair with his parents, which took months and cost everyone something, and which ended in Diane sitting at our kitchen table saying things she had worked hard to get right, and Clara accepting every word with a grace that I could not have matched. Thomas came separately and said he was ashamed. I told him I understood, and I think I meant it. The town found its way back in its own time, awkwardly at first and then genuinely. Sophie threw a dinner she called a homecoming, and which was also, in the particular brightness of her face all evening, a quiet celebration of her sister having been completely right. The first few weeks at home were a kind of careful navigation. We moved around each other slowly, relearning the geography of sharing a space after 16 months of living in very different geographies. I didn't always know what to do with myself. The house was the same size it had always been, but I kept finding myself standing in the middle of rooms without a clear purpose, which was the opposite of how I had spent the past year, in which every action had had a very immediate purpose or you didn't do it. Clara gave me space without making the space feel like distance, which is harder than it sounds. She had, it turned out, thought carefully about this, in the way she thought carefully about most things. She had read things. She had asked a social worker at the Veterans Center downtown what to expect, what helped, and what didn't. She had not told me she had done this because she hadn't wanted me to feel managed. I found out about it later from Sophie, who mentioned it in passing, and when I asked Clara about it, she said, "I was going to get you home. I was going to be ready when you got there." That's what she's like, Clara. That's the whole person. She keeps the light on, and she reads the literature, and she does not announce that she's doing either. One evening in May, sitting on the back porch, the first warm evening of the year, the garden coming back to life, and the tomatoes cooperating for once, I asked her which night was the hardest. Of all 14 months. Which one? She was quiet for a while. Then, the night his mother stopped calling. Not because it surprised me, but because I understood then that if I turned out to be wrong, I was going to be standing in that wrong place completely alone. I asked how she kept going after that. She looked at the garden. Then she said, "You would have. If it were me, you would have." I thought about the hospital in Germany and the specific fear of not knowing what she had been told, not knowing what she had been carrying, not knowing whether she had given up or held on. I thought about what I had said to myself on the worst nights. She is waiting. Get up. I thought about whether I had known that, or had simply needed it badly enough to hold it as though it were true. I think it was both. I think sometimes those two things are exactly the same thing. Sophie came around on her own terms, in her own time. About a month after I got home, she showed up on a Saturday morning with coffee and a specific expression that Clara recognized as the one Sophie wore when she was about to say something she had been drafting for a while. She sat down at the kitchen table and she said to Clara, "I should have believed you." Clara said, "You stayed." Sophie said, "That's not the same thing." Clara thought about it. "No," she said, "but it's almost everything." They sat there with their coffee for a while without saying much else. That's one of the things I love about the two of them. They know how to be in a room together without needing to fill all the air. I came in from the back porch and saw them sitting there, And I understood, without being told, that something had been said and resolved, and that the resolution would not be mentioned again, and that this was the correct way to handle it. I poured myself coffee and sat down with them. In June, we sat on the front porch after dinner, the way we used to before all of this. Fireflies had started up over the yard. The air smelled like Tennessee summer just beginning to arrive. After a while, she said, without looking at me, "You never really doubted me, did you?" I looked at her in the evening light. "No," I said, "never." She nodded. "I didn't doubt you either." I reached over and took her hand, the way I have reached for her hand since we were 14 years old. She turned her hand over and held mine. "Leave the light on," I said. She looked at me sideways with the corner of a smile. "Always," she said. That is the whole truth of this story. Not the IED, and not the captivity, and not the rescue, which has its own facts but belongs in a different kind of telling. The truth is, a woman who understood in her bones something that most people only believe in theory, that love is not a feeling you sustain. It is a decision you keep making. And it looks from the outside like stubbornness, and from the inside, it feels like holding a rope in the dark without knowing whether there is anything on the other end, and holding it anyway. It's the notebook in the drawer. It's the letters to the congressman. It's refusing, politely and without drama, to attend a funeral with no body in it. It's choosing, every night for 14 months, to get up one more time and turn on the porch light. Not because you know, because you refuse to act as though you don't. And then one evening in November, after all that refusing, after all those nights, a bus turns onto your road, and you go to the door before the knock comes, and the person you left the light on for is standing there in boots that don't quite fit, thinner and slower, and changed in ways it will take both of you a long time to learn, and you say, "You're late." And they say, "I know." And that is the miracle. Nothing louder than that. Just two people who kept their word to each other across a distance that had no business being survivable. Just a light at the end of a long road, burning where it was supposed to be, patient and ordinary and absolute.